Thanks, Greg. And let me just start by saying that maybe network utilisation isn't the sexiest topic that you've ever confronted at this forum, but at least let me try to give me 5 minutes to convince you that it's a red-hot opportunity for consumers, providing that we think about it critically. But firstly, a huge thanks to ECA for getting this work off the ground, to our fabulous industry reference group who guided us throughout this. If you could pop the slides up, that'd be great. And also to my co-authors, Ibrahim, Jonathan and David. Now, oh, missed this title slide. So part of this, big renewables and nuclear capture a lot of the headlines these days, but the cost of electricity networks is perhaps the biggest important and most important individual line item that makes a difference to consumer bills at the end of the day. So this part of today's program is all about value. How do we actually know if we're getting value out of our very expensive network assets? Well, one way that we understand this is through a metric called network utilisation. So it measures the intensity of grid usage, and regulators use that to look at the trend, and they compare it with other indices to determine whether or not consumers are getting good value out of the networks. And what does it look like in 2025? Well, on average in the NEM, it's about 43%, down from 57% around 20 years ago. On the face of it, doesn't sound like a great exam score. But what does it actually tell us? And does it still make any sense in 2025? So network utilisation measures how close zone substation assets are to their capacity limit on the highest demand day of the year. And that's then averaged across the network. So if we think about that graphically, we simply take this single annual peak load, shown here in green, and we divide it by the capacity, that red line there. And then what we end up with is a top bit, looks like it's not quite working, but we end up with the top bit in grey, just under the red line, that is deemed unutilised. That is deemed unutilised, and the bit in blue that's deemed utilised. But the problem is that in practice, anything that's not under this demand curve that's is actually unutilised. So this is our first problem, because we're actually ignoring these less utilised non-peak hours, and we're completely ignoring the other 364 days of the year of what happens with that asset. Now, a second problem with this, with these metrics is that when solar or storage flatten peak demand, the metric declines. So when you do a good thing, the metric declines, which seems bad. So the metric can't actually make sense of what happens when you have two-way flows on the network. And finally, is higher utilisation good or is it bad? So is it represent efficient use of infrastructure or assets running at a greater risk? And the answer is kind of both. So we set out to just unpack some of these issues by proposing some new metrics. And so we developed two headline metrics and a bunch of secondary ones that together help to manage this tension between having an efficient and affordable network at one end of the spectrum and a resilient and reliable but expensive network at the other end. So the first headline metric gives us a less ambiguous target that you really want to maximise: total energy throughput utilisation. Sounds fancy, but it essentially gets the total amount of useful energy that is derived from connecting to the network, including not only grid imports, but also grid exports and self-consumption from local CER. And this tries to keep us down this efficient and affordable end of the spectrum. The higher the number, the better. So, because notionally, if you're paying off your infrastructure per kilowatt hour and you can double the throughput, you can halve your effective per kilowatt hour network cost. So, as we're electrifying vehicles, cooking and water heating, we can do so by filling these troughs when the network is underutilised. We've got massive potential to lower network prices, and this metric gives you a way of measuring that. And of course, this value for customers still needs to be delivered within the capacity bounds of the infrastructure. So we've got this other metric, two-way power flow utilisation, which is quite similar to the traditional metric, but it accounts for capacity constraints in the forward direction and the reverse direction, which can happen when you've got areas of high PV penetration. And just the final point that I've got time to make is about that these metrics are not just for networks to submit to regulators to check. And nor are they really necessarily even about creating incentives to tie network revenues to. What matters is that the solutions to getting better value out of the network are actually collaborative and they're actually distributed. So making the data open and transparent at the most granular level possible will help networks, industry and community stakeholders to actually gather around and develop solutions to improve utilisation and consumer outcomes. Currently, you can only get this data at the entire network level, but this is sort of a mock-up of what we think it should look like at the a map view at the zone substation level at least. So our report's available on this QR code with recommendations, but essentially we suggest that the AER can start calculating these metrics and collecting the data in 2025 performance reporting and beyond. Thanks very much.